Wow, you just got all that. Thanks, James. Okay, so this is just talking to you. So welcome to the Center for Digital Scholarship and Curation. Happy to see you all here. I am Kim Kristen, one of the co-directors of the CDSC, along with my colleague Trevor Bond. If you haven't been here before, welcome. I see some return faces. The CDSC was started 2 years ago as a joint initiative between the libraries and the College of Arts and Sciences. And our mission is to promote collaborations around technology that are socially empowering and ethically minded. So we have a fall forum that last year was around Black Lives Matters. And we have a spring speaker series. So some of you have been to that, where we bring in speakers, such as Sharon today, who I'll introduce in just a moment. So, and we have workshops. So if you haven't been here before, please join us for, you can look at our website and see what's going on. So today, for this afternoon, I'm really excited to introduce Sharon Leone, who is the Director of Public Projects at Center for History and New Media at George Mason, and she's an Associate Professor in the History and Art History Department. She received her Bachelor's of Arts degree in American Studies from Georgetown University and her doctorate in American Studies from University of Minnesota. At George Mason, she oversees collaborations with library, museum, and archive partners from around the world and the country, and manages the center's digital exhibits and archiving projects. And as many of you know, she works on her the projects at the center, digital tools, including Omecha and Scripto. And any of you are interested in those, we certainly can help you with those here at the CDSC. She's working on a current project, User-Centered Digital History, Doing Public History on the Web, which I'm certainly looking forward to. It sounds like very interesting. So I want to welcome Sharon. Yeah, you have the gift. Sorry, forget the I want to welcome Sharon to the CDSC, to Nez Perce territory. We are, WSU is built on the unceded territory of the Nez Perce tribe. So we have, if you can learn some about this, was produced at their center.
That's
and we
lovely.
Have, I noticed your computer.
Oh yeah, I need
so
some stickers.
I got some
I didn't
swag
know
for
that you had stickers. That's
yes.
great. Yes.
And a bag for
and
you
a bag.
too.
Okay,
So.
I will happily advertise. As you can tell, I'm all about the advertising. So yes, we'll put you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we'll attach those.
Yes. So please
That's
give
excellent.
Sharon a warm welcome, and we're really looking forward
Very
to her
good.
talk today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First want to say thank you to Kim and to Trevor for inviting me to spend some time with you all today. The first thing I want to do is check and make sure that you can hear me. I can use the side mic, but folks in the back, hearing okay? Okay, all right, so we'll try to avoid using the mic. I'm also going to have to negotiate the reading glasses. So I can now see my notes, but I can't see you. So wave big if you have questions, and you should feel free to interrupt me along the way if I'm not clear about anything. So my talk today is called Complicating, a Great Man Narrative of Digital History. And we're sort of in a process, I think, as people who do digital humanities, of trying to correct what has been a really singular and linear narrative about where the work in the field has come from. And that seems kind of like a no-brainer, because a field as large as digital humanities is going to have lots of origin stories. And so the piece that I'm going to talk about today is, one way we can approach it is to acknowledge the fact that digital history is part of the origins of digital humanities. So I'm going to ask you to take that as a given, because the part I'm going to talk about today is why, even when we talk about digital history, there are no women in the narrative for some reason. And so if we were to begin, if we thought about the big names and factors and people that we would think about in the history of digital history, some names come to mind. They would be Ed Ayers from UVA, Stephen Breyer, Josh Brown from CUNY, Dan Cohen, Roy Rosenzweig from the Center for History and New Media at George Mason, and Will Thomas, also originally from UVA. And so when we get the narrative of where digital history came from, it usually starts with those folks. the narrative is almost totally devoid of women. And for a decade now, scholars have begun their search for what looks like digital humanities with a piece from the Companion to Digital Humanities written by Susan Hockey. And it's called The History of Humanities Computing. And it tells a story that's deeply steeped in computational text analysis and text processing. And it starts with Father Bussa here and his quest to use IBM to create a concordance of Thomistic writings and all of those sorts of things. It leads then to the text encoding initiative and then, sort of thematic source collections on the internet. Hockey's narrative leads toward literary and linguistic things, little attention to how those disciplinary commitments in the fields such as history, archaeology, anthropology have found their way into influencing the digital humanities. Those stories are saved for subsequent essays in that bigger collection. And one of them that turns us to digital history comes from Will Thomas. We're going to take, this is, if you're a digital historian, this is probably a screenshot you'll be familiar with. This is the opening screen of the Valley of the Shadow project, which is known as sort of the digital history project. Will Thomas has an essay in that companion to digital humanities. It's called Computing in the Historical Imagination. And so he went searching for some background on history and how historians have interacted with digital humanities. And that also has become a singular narrative of the origin of digital history. And it starts in the 60s and 70s, thinking about the quantitative history movement, signaled most clearly by Fogel and Engerman's Time on the Cross. We're thinking about slavery and computational approaches and the ways that historians pushed back against that analysis. Various social history projects give us, statistical and computational analysis, and then we sort of get into a larger, expansive interest in historical methods. As computing technologies become more affordable and easier, this is Thomas's narrative, historians embrace the use of databases to track and analyze sources. And then in the 90s, we get access to the World Wide Web, which offers another set of possibilities for expanding historical sources, expanding access to historical sources and combining them in new ways for scholarship and teaching. And Will Thomas and Ed Ayers worked for many, 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 many years on the Valley of the Shadow with an army of people, some of whom we're going to talk about today. It started primarily as a teaching project, but a number of scholarly books came out of that base. He then goes on to suggest that there are larger possibilities with historical GIS and capacities for the 21st century. And it's, that's pretty much the familiar story. Thomas's version of the emergence of digital history methods doesn't include or cite any digital historians who are women. None. The one person he mentions is Anne Kelly Knowles, who is a geographer, who happens to do historical GIS. So we'll give him that. So published shortly after the Companion. So the Companion is 2004. Roy Rosenzweig and Dan Cohen wrote a book called Digital History, A Guide to Gathering, Preserving, and Presenting the Past. So that's 2005. These two people are two of my favorite people on the face of the earth. This book offers sort of a practical guide to how to do digital history. And it opens with a history of the field. It's a little bit more inclusive than Thomas's narrative about genres and approaches. It's much more welcoming to sort of popular and, dare we say, amateur approaches to building digital history, because it's an early history of digital history on the web, and lots of those projects were done by people who were not credentialed historians or at home in museums. And so we get a little bit of a different definition of scholarship. It includes examples of projects that are designed for the public and that target K-12 audiences, but Rosenzweig and Cohen also managed to point to the work of only one woman in that chapter, and it's Catherine Kish Sklar, who with Thomas Dublin worked on the Women in Social Movements project, which is this giant collection of stuff now. But so that's 2005, from people who are generally open to these issues, and just no women. No women. Just about at that time when they're thinking about this, one of the things that they're thinking about as an early project in digital history, this is a shot of History Matters as it used to look. History Matters was an effort to put a survey course on the web. It was a collaborative project between the Center for History and New Media and the American Social History Project. It since has a different design, but this is as it looked when it arrived in 1999. Thank you, Wayback Machine. And then in 2002, the center moved on to sort of collecting projects to try and collect the born digital evidence of the recent past. And this is the original design for the September 11th Digital Archive. That was also a collaboration with ASHP. And so those focus on teaching and public projects really shaped the way that Roy and Dan talked about digital history. So more recent narratives about digital history. Let's turn our attention to Julie Thompson Klein's work from 2014, so something really recent. And the title of the book is Interdisciplining, I always get this wrong, Interdisciplining Digital Humanities, Boundary Work in an Emerging Field. And so she has a rendition of where digital history comes from too. And basically, she rehearses Thomas's narrative. And when she gets there, she moves from Will Thomas's 2004 piece. She then moves on and includes an interchange amongst scholars that showed up in the Journal of American History in 2008. There were some women who participated in that conversation. She doesn't point any of them out, but that's okay. And a Perspectives piece. Perspectives is the magazine from the American Historical Association that Will Thomas and Doug Seefeld wrote. But no women feature largely in her version of the field. And in fact, most of our conversation about the field after 2004, 2005 is really focused on tool building as opposed to project construction. And so if we look at this little timeline of the sort of interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary tools that have been developed in the interim time, we start to see things like the whole suite of Simile open source software projects. Most of us know the Timeline Builder the best, but there were in fact 92 projects that came out of the Simile group, most of which have died a slow death. CH&M began working on Zotero in 2005. It was originally called SmartFox. Tapper, which is textual analysis, begins in 2006. We began working on Omecha in 2007. The Scholars Lab starts on Neatline in 2009, and in 2009 the Library of Congress also begins work on ViewShare. It starts out as something called Recollection, and the people at Zafira were also originally the people who worked on Simile. So this sort of brief history of the way that we talk about the history of digital history, including no women, brings us to this weird point that there are lots of women who have worked in this field and are active right now. And we could go through and we could name lots of them. So if we start here on the West Coast at the Stanford Center for Spatial and Textual Analysis, we've got Nicole Kidman and Paula Finley. Or at UCLA, there's Miriam Posner and Janice Reif. At the center, there are a whole bunch of us. The leadership is pretty much evenly split, 50-50 between women and men. Folks who are not at larger centers pursuing all sorts of good and important work. Kalani Craig at Indiana is working on medieval stuff. Sharon Block is using computational analysis in interesting ways. Jennifer Giuliano at IUPUI is leading professional development training. Erica Lee at the University of Minnesota is running a huge immigrant history and immigrant digital storytelling project. Michelle Moravic's doing late 20th century feminist studies with computational analysis. Catherine Tomaszek. The list goes on and on and on and on. And yet, the way we tell the history of the field includes no women. So between 2006 and 2015, the American Council on Learned Societies offered this Digital Innovation Fellowship to scholars who wanted to work on a year of support on their own projects. So during that period, there were 14 historians. 5 of them were women. And they're people you know. They're people who should be in this story. Patricia Seed, Ann Sarah Rubin, Abigail Fury, Ruth Mostrin, all sorts of good things. We have even had in the last 2 years a series of working group conferences on women's history and digital history. That started at Bryn Mawr, and the upcoming one is going to be in Ireland. Lots and lots of people. So if we start to look at the work that is going on now and includes a fairly evenly split cohort of women's historians and men's historians, we have to sort of wonder where they came from. You know, we run a summer institute for mid-career faculty, people who want to learn about digital history, who don't know anything about it so far. Over the two that we've run, our applications have been weighted 71% women, 30% men. And our admitted students are 65 women. So we start to ask, how does this happen? So I went to look. And so I went to the NEH grant portal. It's got a name. It's a database of awarded grants. And I went through and I pulled out all of the grants across all of the material that they provide. So this is grants across all of the different divisions that had to do with digital history. Had to do with history at all, and then digital history. And so what I found between 1994, sort of the birth of the web, and 2016, we've got 586 grants. And they give us all sorts of good information about those. And what we find out is that women are PI and co-PI in 300 of those nearly 600 grants. It's a pretty darn 50-50 split. But we're starting to see some of the reasons why, when we look at that list, we don't see these women in the traditional history of digital history. So for those 300 projects where women served as PI or co-PI, only 127, or 42%, were associated with colleges and universities. So that's part of the hint. So if we look at those grants, and this is probably should be bigger, it's going to be a little bit harder to see. I sorted them by the division that awarded them. So we've got 30% of the projects, 89 of the projects, came out of the Division of Preservation and Access. Preservation and Access, libraries, archives, special collections, right? 86 out of public programs. That's public history and museum work, right? 39 out of the Education Division, pedagogical projects. 36 out of the Office of Digital Humanities. The important thing to remember here is that the Office of Digital Humanities didn't exist before 2008. So anybody who wants to define digital history or digital humanities by the grants that are awarded out of ODH has a very short window that they're looking at. 25 for the federal and state partnership projects. Those are the state humanities councils, okay? 20 projects out of the Division of Research. So research covers all sorts of things, including translation and those sorts of things, but also individual project fellowships. And then 5 projects out of the Challenge Grant project, so center building, institution building. So what this starts to tell us is that the ventures that women are leading in digital history are associated with work in libraries and archives, museums, public humanities, and teaching and learning. Not necessarily the things that tenured faculty at universities think of as scholarship. Not necessarily the kinds of things that they want to recognize as scholarship. So the relative gender parity among PIs and co-PIs in the NEH-funded digital history projects suggests that there are all sorts of factors that are preventing us from recognizing this work. One reason, possible reason, is the reason we haven't seen significant leadership of women in digital history is there's just, hands down, proven fact, pervasive general citation bias. We just know that. It's across fields, so we're going to take that and sort of set it aside. That research can't be discounted here, but once we recognize that women were there as active agents and innovators and guiding and shaping all of these projects, we got to look a little bit deeper at the field of history and try and reclaim where these women participated and why, and what kinds of positions they hold and why we don't recognize them for being there. So what I'm going to argue is that there are significant structural factors in labor conditions that have combined to perpetuate sort of this wrong great man theory narrative of digital history. And that's about status, access, flexibility, and authorizing and credentialing systems. So first, structures within the academy have historically slowed women historians' advancement, preventing them from surfacing in top of the masthead roles, leadership positions in digital projects. Second, I'd say that a narrow focus on project directors, people at the PI level, make us not see these women doing lots of work on the ground. Third, if we limit our attention to digital work done within the halls of academia, we exclude the work of loads of women who work in non-academic jobs or in non-tenure track faculty jobs. Furthermore, the ways that public history recognizes and attributes its work works against recognizing individuals. And so together, these conditions make it really easy for historians of digital history to perpetuate the impression that the pioneering work in the field was done all by men. But once we go looking for these folks, these women, we start to see them, and we start to see the earlier projects in a different way. And so this larger version of what Rob Townsend calls the historical enterprise is really important to seeing the full body of labor that work to make these projects possible. So I want to suggest that we definitely have to look beyond the senior faculty to see this. So academic labor practices and conditions and structures have really conspired to mask or reduce the recognition of women's roles in digital history. Also, history departments are conservative, slow to recognize digital work as valid scholarship. You know, so much so that in April of 2015, the American Historical Association organized a cluster of articles debating the concept of history as a book discipline. We're still fighting this battle that other kinds of scholarly productions count. So the methodological conservatism absolutely has something to do with it. But women are doubly disadvantaged in doing digital work because of the ways in which the digital work itself depends on contingent faculty and staff to produce it. So, but the ongoing concern about the professional status of women in history has been longstanding. So in 1969, the American Historical Association, the AHA, formed an ad hoc committee on the status of women, which was then instituted as a larger committee on women's historians in 1971. And they produced a report called the Rose Report that in 1970 sort of sets the baseline for our understanding about the place of women in the field. And the findings are kind of atrocious at 1970, not totally surprising, but kind of atrocious. In the 1960s, the top 10 history graduate programs granted 15% of their degrees to women, 15 in the top 10 program. But the faculties of those departments were 99% men. All right, this is not going to surprise us, right? But there were 16% of the full professors in history in co-ed colleges were women in 59, 60. By 68, 69, only one of them remained. So we had this early generation of women historians who were on the faculty, and they retired and they hadn't been replaced. So that group from the 30s and 40s went away. So the authors of the report, summarizing the state of the field, it's a little bit of a long quote, but I think it's nice. In history, as in other academic areas, our sample of 30 institutions indicates women are employed primarily in non-tenure track ranks. Moreover, far from abandoning their profession for pure domesticity, their very eagerness to work has made women vulnerable to exploitation. Their readiness and sometimes their need to accept irregular and part-time positions has led to their exclusion from participation in the mainstream of academic rewards and preferment. This is 1970. Sound familiar? Right? Here we are. So we have the survey that follows up in 79, 80. And we take a look. I should have ordered these in the opposite direction, but we're moving from highest rank to most contingent. What we see in the survey is that the percentage of women historians and faculty is 13% of the overall field. And so women comprise 5.9%, basically 6% of the full professors, 11.5% of the associate professors, 25% of the assistant professors, and 40% at the instructor rank. So that's 1979, 1980. So by 1988, things have improved a little bit, but not much. Women are up to 17% of the faculty, 8% at full, 14% at associate, almost 39% at assistant, and 37% at instructor. So we've had a little bit of a bump at assistant. By 98, we only, for comparison here, we only have full and assistant. But women had risen, weirdly, to 55% of the faculty. But what we see here is we've got 18% of the full, and I can't read that number, 55% on the assistant. So things are moving up just slightly. 55% at the assistant role, 18 at the full. And so when, in 2006, the committee publishes the report on the status of women, they did a survey and they got 360 responses. And we get a snapshot of what the field looks like. And time to promotion, long. Salaries, low. They continue to lag behind. Women bear an inordinate brunt of service, which we know. We could say this about most of the fields. Assumptions about gender powerfully shape the subjective, if standardized, teaching evaluations. We've all seen the text mining analysis of Rate My Professor and the way that teaching evaluations talk about women. Child care, elder care, all of these concerns are voiced by women in the State of the Field survey in 2006. All of this, to me, brings back the work of sociologist Arlie Hochschild talking about The Second Shift, which is a book from 1989 and never ever seems to go away, is that women are doing 2 or 3 jobs at one time. Combining that with history department's slowness to recognize digital scholarship for promotion and tenure pretty much is the sweet spot for women who do digital history work on the tenure track not getting recognized and not getting promoted. MLA has had review and promotion and tenure guidelines on digital scholarship since 2000. They revised them recently, and the combination of the Organization of American Historians, National Council on Public History, and AHA since 2010 have had guidelines on public history. But AHA just got around to authorizing guidelines on review of digital scholarship for traditional digital history work and promotion just in the last couple of years. So, but even with all of these pressures, women are doing digital history work even from within the academy. So some of you might recognize the publication has been redesigned since then. We're just going to take a Wayback Machine tour today. Commonplace was this really nice early American journal that brings together all sorts of useful things. It was originally edited by Jane Kaminsky and Jill Lepore, who are super productive Ivy League historians. Both of them do early American work. But you know Jill Lepore from the New Yorker and those sorts of things. But they were quick off the blocks in 2000 to realize that this was going to be a medium that would be interesting for the profession. So it's one of the very first attempts to create a fully digital publication for the historical community, and featured columns and all sorts of things like that. It's now housed by the American Antiquarian Society and the University of Connecticut, and continues to today. And that's one of the most interesting things about it, is that it has survived for the last 17 years. The Journal of American History began to publish reviews of digital projects in 2001. So if you think that there's no review process for digital work out there, it's not true. The Journal of American History has been doing reviews in every issue, for an issue, since 2001. And the very first project to be reviewed was something called Do History. Any of you who are early Americanists know Laurel Thatcher Ulrich's book, A Midwife's Tale. There was a movie that went along with it, and Do History is a teaching site, a magical, wonderful teaching site that holds up even now, 17 years later, for working with this particular primary source. And so it was the very first site that was reviewed, and it was reviewed by Jane Kaminsky. So we've got sort of this cohort of forward-thinking women in the Ivy Leagues who are like, oh, this might be something interesting. None of those folks have done digital projects since then, really. But they were a start. So we get to 2012, and we look at the split of the faculty overall. And what we find out is that women make up about 40% of the faculty in four-year history faculty in four-year institutions. So the number has gone up. You know, we started at 5 or so, and now we're up to 40. But because the promotion and advancement rate is slower, it is really hard in some ways for women to get the slot at the top of that masthead as the principal investigator. And so we have to look beyond the principal investigator in order to see where these women are. So the attribution of credit often only stops at the principal investigator, and in fact that NEH database includes only the PI and doesn't tell us anything about the army of folks who have worked on these projects along the way. And so if we go back to thinking about contingency, soft money, and we're going to talk a little bit about the Collaborators' Bill of Rights and how to go beyond the digital. So if we think about not only looking at senior faculty for the PIs, in many institutions it's not possible to be the leader on a grant unless you're regular faculty. So that means that if you're a staff person, you have to find a faculty person to take the masthead to submit the application. So that's one problem right there. The fact that most digital history gets put out on the basis of soft money, money from grants, means that it's often hard for these folks to have, who work in these projects, to have full-time regular jobs. And so if you're hired only on soft money and not on university salary, the chance that you get to lead that project goes down considerably. And so that's part of the reason why we have to look a little bit further down the page. So if we go back to the Valley of the Shadow as this project that everybody thinks of as the beginning of digital history, that comes to the web in 1993. It wins a James Harvey Robinson Teaching Award in 2002 and a Merlot Teaching Award, all sorts of things, history classics. We think about that project as being a project that was produced by Ed Ayers and Will Thomas. But it turns out that there are a whole bunch of co-editors on that project, including Ann Sarah Rubin and Andrew Torgett, who is now off doing other things. Rubin was a grad student when she started working on that project. She served as project manager between 93 and 96, and actually even took the year off from graduate school in the 95-96 year to work on the project. So actually slowed her advancement to her PhD to push this project out. But if we look at the products of the project, there are a set of edited collections, and she was co-author with Ed Ayers on the Valley of the Shadow collections, the Part 1 collection. As I said before, she went on to earn an ACLS Digital Innovation Fellowship, which allowed her to produce a companion site that went along with the book that she wrote on Sherman's March. So if we think about the other projects, the stuff that comes out of the American Social History Project. So the American Social History Project is housed at CUNY, and that's where we get Steve Breyer and Josh Brown, and they partner with the Center for History and New Media on History Matters. And so the team at ASHP is also, and has always been, evenly split between men and women. So in addition to Josh Brown and Steve Breyer, we've got Penny Bender and Ellen Noonan, and then eventually Andrea Vasquez. And those folks, for most of the time, have not been regular faculty, and they just don't show up. But they have always taken leadership roles in those projects. At the center, there was Roy, but also Kelly Schrum from the very beginning. And so together that team produced History Matters. It won all sorts of awards. But because most folks don't read down the About page, they don't see those folks. And for years and years, like me, the folks at ASHP, and this was true of Kelly too, were research faculty, soft-funded research faculty, not on tenure lines. And so if we look at the folks who run the technical jobs in these projects, too, we start to see more women. We see Elena Rezlogova as the webmaster at the center for many years. We see Stephanie Herder as the lead designer. We see Amanda Schumann as a longtime application developer, and Joan Troiano as a project manager. And that only brings us to the first 10 years of the web. And we do that simply by looking down the page a little bit. So what I would like to suggest is that in addition to looking down the page is that we pay really close attention to the work that came out of the meeting at the Maryland Institute for Technology and Humanities in 2011. The most useful thing an ODH meeting has given us, as far as I'm concerned, is the Collaborators' Bill of Rights. And the Collaborators' Bill of Rights, you know, this meeting was headed up by Tanya Clement and Doug Reside, and gave us a set of principles by which we have to actually recognize the contributions of everybody who participates in these projects. And so if we want to resurface these women from the earlier projects, we could go back and write the history of the projects in the ways that recognize all of their contributions. So doing that, being honest about it, and being fully descriptive about the way that women work in these digital history projects should help some of the lack of recognition. But we actually have to, you know, we have to read those about pages and credits. And since I wrote about this the first time, we've seen a shift in the review criteria listing for the digital history reviews in the Journal of American History to actually include more of the individual producers. And I want to take some time to think about why. So in addition to the Collaborators' Bill of Rights, the fourth point you have to think about is building time into the project structure to allow everyone to write about the project. Often, the folks who get the opportunity to publish in traditional venues about their digital history work are traditional faculty who have research time that they feel like they can dedicate to crafting a piece. For contingent faculty who work on soft money, your work is directed to the next project, the next set of deliverables. And so if we don't build in to the project plan the opportunity for everyone to write about their role, those publications never get published. And so we see Will Thomas and Ed Ayers writing about the value of the shadow. We see Dan Cohen writing about September 11th. We see Josh and Steve at ASHP writing about the September 11th Digital Archive. And we don't see the other people who worked on those projects have enough time to craft those pieces. So the other thing we want to say is that if we look at the reviewed projects that were reviewed by the Journal of American History between 2001 and 2015, you start to see the problem with the way the projects are listed. So what I have here is the distribution of the kinds of creators for these projects. So 19% commercial software companies, textbook publishers, those sorts of things. 28 projects, it's not 19%, it's 19 projects. 28 projects, which is 22%, list women, 40 list men. And then we start to see, maybe I actually have them here, then we start to see the larger groups. We've got libraries and archives, public history organizations, and universities. And you can see that the bulk of the projects are listed as these corporate entities, right? And that's a traditional practice of museums, libraries, and archives. It is the work of the unit, not the work of an individual person. So this tradition of claiming credit as an individual scholar doesn't hold in those situations. This is particularly troubling when we see that women who work in digital history often work in places that are not universities. They're credentialed like traditional historians. They probably have a PhD. They've been working for a long time. But if we go look at these fields, what we see is that in 2009, the American Association of Museums did a survey of its field, right? And 47% of their workforce is women. We can't tell whether 40% of them are historians, but just the workforce in general. So that gives you a little bit of an idea. If we take a look at the archival profession, this is from 2006, 65% of their membership, their participants, are women. And this is almost an exact reversal from the 1950s. So we're seeing a feminization of the labor force. We can look side by side for the National Council on Public History between 1980 and 2008. And we've seen an exact flip-flop from 36% of the workforce being women in 1980 to 65% being part of the workforce, pretty much contemporary. So we've seen this major shift in who's doing the work of public history archives and museums. And in the midst of that shift, we're starting to bury the real revolutionary folks who are women in digital history. Some of you may recognize this site. This was the very first digital collection that was put online at the Library of Congress in the American Memory Project. The Civil War photographs. It no longer looks like this. They again have redesigned, but it was the first collection out of the Prints and Photographs division, and this would not have been possible without the work of Martha Anderson. But you got to know how the Library of Congress works to know that Martha Anderson came out of the leadership of the National Digital Library Project that started out building these things on laser discs, and then in 1995 put them on the web. But Martha went on to lead the NDIP project, the preservation project, and mentored an army of really important people to digital preservation, like Abby Grotke. Or if we look at the Model Editions project that was funded by NHPRC, which is the funding unit out of the National Archives. Many of these groundbreaking digital documentary editions are edited by women. And so you have to know that the papers of Margaret Sanger are in there, and so that's Esther Katz and Kathy Hajo. And the papers of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan Anthony and Eleanor Roosevelt and all of those people, Holly Schulman, Alita Black, really important people in the field, not regular faculty. Some of them, yes, most of them, no. So, and we miss them completely. This is the only thing I will ever point to that was, well, besides Valley of the Shadow, that is driven by TEI. Just want to say I'm not a huge fan of TEI, but that's because of what I do. If we move on to the museum field, what we start to see is that women are building groundbreaking educational work and materials that are coming out from the museums. And so this whole cloth site, again, really early. It comes online in 1998, and it's shepherded into being by Susan Simalian, who is at Brown, who took a year sabbatical at the Lemelson Center at NMAH to do a history of technology project that used textiles to teach history of technology. This site doesn't exist at all anymore. And then we see something like a more perfect union, where we see curators who start. So the curator that shepherded this project onto the web is a wonderful woman named Jennifer Jones, who started as an intern at NMAH and worked her entire career there. This was a lovely exhibit. It is an amazing site. It's won a ton of awards, and it came into the world in 2001. And at least deep in the credits for the site, you can see the curators who worked on it. But had you visited the exhibit in the museum, you'd never have any idea. And lots of the groundbreaking digital history work came out of museums in this way. And unless we go looking for these folks, we won't see them. The last site I want to look at, I know it's red, but it is hands down one of my favorite sites ever. It's the Radon Deerfield site. I cannot say Pecumtuck unless I say it very slowly. But it's a wonderful site because it is designed specifically to teach the historical method and approach of recognizing multiple perspectives. And it's baked into the structure of the site. And top to bottom, staffed, designed, and built by women. So Lynn Spryker, Angela Goebel-Bain, Barbara Matthews, Juliet Jacobson. So these folks are here, and we need to reinsert them back into the narrative. And so what I want to suggest is that we have some things that we have to do. Is that we have to obviously look beyond the principal investigator. And that means that we have to look beyond the traditions of the discipline. We need to look into other mediums. And we have to be really clear about claiming and sharing credit. If you were at my workshop this morning, I probably said we 7,000 or 8,000 times in the course of 2 hours. Every once in a while, we got to say I. As much as we might not want to, it's collaborative work and all of those sorts of things, just to make people take notice. That we have to look beyond the halls of the academy to see the larger practice of the historical enterprise and the field. And that we have to look into, not really beyond, but actually into the organizations. Once we get to that spot, we can start to recover women in the narrative and then move on to ask the question, what does the difference make? What difference does seeing women make? How do we start to see the work differently? And what we start to see is different areas of investigation, different approaches to collaboration, different areas of production and audience. You'll see that most of these, there was an emphasis on teaching and the way that thinking critically about teaching doesn't get valued in traditional narratives. And that, it's girl stuff. That's what that's code for. It's girl stuff. Teaching. That's not real research. And so we have to start to have those conversations about digital history, too. If we cast this all as a conspiracy of neoliberal tools, to go back to some work from, I hesitate to call it work, some reflection from last year or so, I don't think that's the case at all. I think that if we see digital humanities and digital history and toolmaking as the conspiracy of digital neoliberal tools, we're not seeing the field. And so I think we probably need to start doing that. So with that, we should talk about those things. And I'm going to take my glasses off so I can see you.
So, thank you, Sharon. Before I have the microphone for questions. Sorry, I'm just like reeling from your talks. I'm like, Ryan, usually I'm not speechless. So, that was fantastic. Questions, who has questions? And I'll walk around with the mic. I know, Roger, you're just like, I knew I have one. He's always the first, but
good.
It's good.
It's good. Questions are good.
I really loved one thing that Kim tweeted while you were talking was that the naming of women is very important, and I wonder if you could sort of, maybe this is obvious, but maybe one way that we could do this in our own talks when we're giving talks, sort of highlighting those accomplishments and also sort of rethinking, asking our colleagues to rethink how they think about these projects.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point, and I think that that we should do it, and we need to do it. And I said that in lots of ways, Roy is my hero. He would not have stood for this naming of him as, this beacon in digital history. He never gave a talk about a project that he did not have a slide that named the entire team, ever. And under any circumstances, and I think it's a really important practice. That it only takes a minute, and if you can talk about something else while that stands on the screen and people can sort of soak it in, it's important to do. Yeah.
So I really enjoyed the talk, and I really enjoyed kind of pulling out the different kind of projects that included these women on them, and thinking about the invisible work. On all sorts of the levels, but I would love to see like an Omecha collection of these collections. Like where do you know if there is one?
There isn't,
because that's a history that I feel like is.
Yeah, well, so we have a history of the center that's an Omecha collection, and some of that is written for our projects because we did it as a celebration of our 20th anniversary. But it could be, we could certainly do more. The other piece that I think that is so powerful, and I'm not going to remember who started it, but the list of women in DH, if you can't find somebody for your panel, here's the list of thousands and thousands of women you could ask to participate. You're not allowed to have a panel with just men on it anymore. Those kinds of things need to happen. The thing is that DH runs on external funding. Mm-hmm. And so unless we decide as a community to build that collection and tell those stories, it's not going to happen because nobody's going to fund it. Maybe we could ask ODH to fund it, but we need ODH to continue to exist. Call your Congress people.
Thank you for the talk, Sharon. And this is a follow-up to Devin's question. I think it's something that came up in the workshop this morning, certainly in your talk. And I was wondering if you could just muse on the challenge of sustainability in DH and your need in preparing this to go to the Wayback Machine to even find these sites, and how that very ephemeral nature of digital projects hinders recognition and review, and
it's it's a really important factor. So Bethany Novisky has written really nicely about graceful degradation and when it's time to let projects die, and those sorts of things. And at the center we have this nearly 25-year commitment to not letting anything die, and so we're carrying these creaking projects along that are held together with baling twine and chewing gum. But we've made this promise to keep them up, and it's a ton of work. But I think that we have much better facilities for web archiving now than we did, and that's a tribute to Martha Anderson and Abby Grotke and that team at the Library of Congress and the NDIP folks, that we can make work files, and we can run emulators, and we can actually preserve these sites so that we can let them go and make them artifacts so that we can find them. But it's hard, and when the only option you have is the Wayback Machine, there's not a lot there. You can't drill down in those sites. You get your sort of top of the site snapshot, and then you sort of have to imagine everything else. But I spent, probably 2 months Googling the crap out of of these projects and these people's names, looking for project narratives, looking for grant proposals and grant reports. That's another, so now everything that the ODH takes in as a grant report is part of that database. It can become public, the white papers become public record. And that's really important gray literature for us understanding the field. And so all of that stuff, needs to go into institutional repositories, needs to be made available. I do worry about my tendency to say, put it in the institutional repository. Well, somebody's got to support the institutional repository. That's your job. Yeah. But we as institutions and people in the field, we have to be clear about our investment and our need for gathering that history and holding on to it, and for the institutions making investments in those structures and the staff that we need to support them.
To you, because you're very close, but I think for the historical record.
That's right. You could just walk up to my lapel, and then people would be horrified. So.
I want to start with just a comment to say that even though the picture you paint is neither new or surprising, it's really important that we get the details, and the specific work you've done is really important for reminding us of that. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And my question is about how specific some of the problem is to the digital humanities or digital history. It seems like some of the problems that are specific to academia or general problems with universities and higher ed.
Right.
But I wonder if something about the way that digital projects have been housed in institutions and the collaborative nature of them, the interdisciplinary nature of them, makes this a more acute problem, or if you think it's just part of one piece of a bigger picture in higher ed.
Yeah, no, I waffle on whether it's a higher ed problem, whether it's a history problem, whether it's a digital humanities problem. I think it's shades of all of those things. Obviously, sort of looking at the place of women in the field of history has nothing to do with the digital at all. It's sort of look at women in the place of the field of history, and then add digital as sort of as a kind of handicap. But you can do the same thing across all of the other disciplines. And but But I think, so part of what's implied here and what's implied in some of the literature is that digital humanities was going to be this liberatory space that was going to, erase some of these things. And, the founders, you look at those men that we name as sort of founders, and we have military historians, Civil War historians, and labor historians. And in both cases, those folks are sometimes predisposed. They tend to some days not see gender in their work at large. And so, that exacerbates the problem a little bit too, I think. So I think it's a little bit of everything.
It strikes me that one way to displace the great man narrative is to write about tools, but then we lose maybe the perspective on gender.
Right. Well, so if we write about tools, and then we lose people. Right? And so, I'll take the social historians, even if they're going to miss gender, if I can add it back, those sorts of things. But as somebody who makes a tool, and I make a tool that I try really hard to make accessible and encourage people to use for good. I don't want to not the Google, don't be evil, but we try to make it so that it predisposes people to make ethical choices about how they interact with the world and those kinds of things. You certainly can't control what people do with those sorts of things. But also, we don't write very much about those choices and why we do those sorts of things. And we got to do more of that.
Thanks for that, Sharon. And that was, as Roger said, I tweeted during your talk that what struck me was your over and over naming of actual women.
Yeah.
I mean, it's one thing to say, like, women are erased, because we are, but it's another thing to just your list, and it wasn't the same person. It was over and over again. And that importance of naming, it's why we start all of our presentations with naming the Nez Perce on this land, because it reminds us where we are, who, that who's doing the work, who's doing the labor, who should be recognized. So as a pivot from your comment there, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about Omecha as a tool and in its conception and then over the years of development. Was there a conscious decision that it was going to be a tool to sort of right this wrong, or I don't know. I'm just
so I don't think that there was a conscious conception that it was going to be a tool to right this particular wrong. The thing at the heart of it was we wanted to make it easier for more people to engage in digital work by sort of clearing some barriers. And in that sense, the mission of the center is supposedly about democratizing history in its practice and collection and teaching. And that was an effort to do that. And we take seriously that when we mean democratizing, we mean for everybody. And so to try and make it as easy as possible to do this work without knowing a lot of technical, not a lot of technical details, but also to do some presets that would encourage us to be good about our data standards. And so if I make you fill out your metadata, I don't make you fill it, but at least it's there. I can encourage you to have structured data, that kind of citation practice moves with the material. And it's, we were talking about this at lunch. It's been used in ways that I never could have imagined, and the kinds of collecting sites and collections. See, I'm gonna get myself in trouble. It is a slippery slope. But the kinds of things that people have built with it that have been attached to social justice goals, I could not be more pleased. Could not be more pleased, but did not anticipate at all. It was really like, we know all of these small house museums have collections they'd like to digitize, and we want to make it possible for them to do stuff on the web. It was like not connected at all. And then it grew into this thing that we're certainly encouraging and supporting a larger mission.
And yet it's still not making its way.
Yeah.
That's the.
Well, I think it's getting better. And that's particularly why this piece is focused on the history. Because we can do the surface read, and then all of a sudden there are women everywhere. So like right now we can name dozens and dozens and dozens of people who are working in the field, and I just don't want it to seem like they just appeared out of the blue in the last 3 or 4 years, because they've always been there.
I just had a really brief question, and this is maybe obvious, but it seems like one particularly vulnerable population when it comes to women getting recognition are, of course, adjuncts, and you mentioned them a few times, but I wonder if it's worth talking about a bit the way in which DH relies on contingent labor.
Sure.
And then, given that a lot of these people, a lot of adjuncts, are in departments that where they aren't, given time to write. They aren't, and you mentioned that a little bit, but they aren't giving money to go to conferences. Those seems to be sort of built-in sort of methods of discrimination. And so I wonder if there's ways that we can, beyond sort of giving more time in the grant, that we can write some of these things.
Right. Well, so that's an interesting. So you heard that as adjuncts, and I heard it as a different kind of contingency, because in my world, adjuncts teach so much they don't get to work on digital projects at all. And so the contingent folks that I'm actually talking about are the people who are like the postdocs that are funded for 2 years to come in and teach a little bit, but also to work on a particular project or to be a fellow in this project. And so that money specifically comes from an external source. And there are complications about that mean that people who, so our center's big, 30, 35. The university pays for the webmaster, it pays for the division leaders, and everybody else is soft, pretty much, regardless of how many years they've been there, regardless of whether they have a PhD, whether they're research faculty. And the demand for cost sharing for federal funding puts those folks at a huge disadvantage in leading their own projects. So if you want to apply for an NEH grant or an IMLS grant to launch a project of your own, you have to bring institutional cost share. And when your salary is paid by the Mellon Foundation, it can't be used as, well, it could be if they let you. But when it's paid by the NEH, you can't use it as cost share for the IMLS. And so these people don't have any resources to bring to leverage to get their own projects underway. And so that's a disadvantage of contingency, in addition to all the others, the having the time to write about the project or even to engage in them at all. But folks who are 100% on soft money are stuck in a mid-level position that they can't level up. And I don't know what to do about that until the universities actually invest in bringing some of these people in full time. But we've got a gazillion priorities. They're huge institutions, so yeah, I don't have a good answer on that one at all.
Anybody else? All right, I think we will thank Sharon, not think we will.
Thank you.
So we have, I think, a few little snacks and whatnot left over, so you're free to...
There's coffee, and it looks like there might be some Cheetos over there, and all sorts of good things.
So please have a little bit, chat. I'm sure Sharon's more than happy to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we'll just sort of hang out for
absolutely.
another 15 or 20 minutes. If any of you, we will have the live stream archived.
Okay. That's
on the CDSC website, so if you want to use it for class or something like that, it will be up there.
Great.
In the next, ask Michael, 2 or 3 weeks. I don't know.
Whenever it's
we get.
available.
Not long. Okay.
Are we done streaming? Okay.